Um, Today, we have to expedite our activities, partly because Simon must leave at 5:30. He has another event that he has to go to. So the game plan is to have Simon speak for about a half an hour and then take questions for about a half an hour. Our normal process would be for me to welcome our audience to this event and then ask my colleague, Krishnan, the Dean of the Hines School, to say a few words. I think we're going to skip some of those formalities so that we can have more time with Simon. So let me go directly to, and first of all, I do have to say thanks to the audience for signing up for this event. And in order to maximize the time we have with Simon, I want to go directly to a brief introduction of Simon. Simon, thank you for being here and thank you for being willing to make an adjustment so that you would be able to appear in our forum. Simon is an assistant professor of history and African American studies at the University of Iowa. He received his PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin. He is both a scholar and a public intellectual. His scholarly essays and opinion pieces have appeared in such media and professional outlets as Time Magazine, Labor, the Washington Post, and the African American Journal of African American History. He is also the recipient of several prestigious research and writing grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Mellon Foundation, to name a couple. Today, he will deliver a lecture based on his first book entitled Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2019. This book won the Benjamin L. Hooks Award from the Institute for Social Change at the University of Memphis. Without further delay, let us welcome Professor Simon Balto.
Thank you so much, Professor Trotter, for that very, very generous invitation. And I want to thank everybody at Carnegie Mellon for, who's attending today in, what I know is a very, very busy time of the semester. And I offer my congratulations and solidarity for everyone getting, near the end of the school year. So what I'd like to do today is as Professor Trotter mentioned, I really want to be talking some about my first book, Occupied Territory, Policing Black Chicago from Red Summer to Black Power. But what I want to kind of do is take a step back and think about how some of the things that I sort of was thinking about and uncovering while I was writing that book and researching that book, and then even in the couple of years since the book now has come out, I want to sort of think a little bit about what the broader implications are for some of this historical research in terms of thinking about our modern crisis, the crisis that we are all living through and bearing witness to, whether you want to define that as being since, May of 2020, or whether you want to define that as being, tethered to the emergence of Black Lives Matter as a movement, or, wherever you'd like to sort of think about the beginnings of that crisis. But part of what I'd like to do with my time here is to sort of indicate the depth of that, the depths of the crisis in terms of its origins and in terms of its development. And so I'm going to be leaning heavily on the history of Chicago because it's the city that I know best. But I'm hoping to sort of help suggest some things that we might think about that are better, that might have broader implications for thinking about the history of racist policing and how it sort of helps us make sense of our present. So by way of doing that, really, I want to just kind of highlight some, what I think are some main themes, or main sort of key points that we might be thinking about related to this. And I'll just sort of go through them in sequence. And, you know, if people would like me to get further into some details about, you know, one particular thing or the other, I'm happy to do that in our Q&A. But so the first thing that I think is important for people to think about when it comes to thinking about the history of policing is really to think about the origins of policing in the United States and thinking about why we have police in the first place. You know, I mean, I think if you were to ask the average person on the street, you know, why do we have police? You know, why were police put into place in the United States? But first of all, they may be just a little bit sort of dumbfounded by the question because the answer seems, you know, perhaps just self-evident. But I think that for the most part, people would say that we have police in the United States because they are needed to, you know, sort of keep us safe, you know, keep everyone safe. But what is a sort of, I think, uncomfortable truth and reality about the history of policing is that that's not really the case. You know, that we can look at the origin stories of municipal police departments in, you know, sort of a variety of different American contexts and understand that, you know, public safety, sort of a generalized public safety, keeping everybody safe, keeping everyone, you know, free from harm, ranked fairly lowly on the original impulse behind the creation of municipal police departments. You know, where this story may be most familiar to some people is in the fact that in plenty of southern cities, you know, Charleston, South Carolina is one such example. You know, the foundation of the municipal police department in that southern city and in multiple southern cities is really inextricable from the history of slave patrols and these other forms of racialized control that were forms of racialized control, but also were forms of law enforcement. You know, people don't want to think about slave patrols as law enforcement because that's sort of cringy, but that really is what we are talking about. We are talking about a law enforcement institution whose task is to police and surveil and arrest people for the crime of trying to free themselves or free their loved ones, you know? And so when we look at these southern police departments, a lot of them grew alongside, if not sort of out of these earlier forms of slave patrol, or these earlier forms of law enforcement in the form of slave patrol. That's not really what happened in Chicago. But I would like to sort of suggest some of why, you know, what happens in Chicago rhymes in some of its logic with what happens in other places. So what happens in Chicago is that Chicago gets a police department for the first time, a municipal police department for the first time in 1853. The reason why it gets a police department in 1853 is not because Chicago was some sort of, you know, cesspool of violence or some kind of cauldron of crime. The reason why it gets a police department in 1853 is because wealthy business owners and civic elites demand the founding of a police department. And the reason why they demand the founding of a police department is primarily for the purpose of controlling the social behaviors of immigrant groups that they think are sort of immoral or unruly and so on and so forth. And when we're talking about immigrant groups within that context, we're talking about people who in today's day and age, we would just sort of think about as being, you know, quote unquote white, but who at that point in time were not particularly desirable new members of the polity in the city of Chicago. So we're talking about German immigrants, we're talking about Irish immigrants, and in particular, you know, these city elites and business owners are concerned about these immigrant communities, you know, drinking habits and other social behaviors. So they go to city policymakers and city politicians and say, look, we need to put in place a police department, and this police department needs to be tasked with helping to curtail, you know, these behaviors that we find sort of scandalizing. And it bears noting that, like, drinking was not a criminal action at that time. Like, the police were not actually enforcing some sort of criminal code when they first started doing these things, but what they were doing was, you know, essentially kind of doing the bidding of these early boosters of the city, who are sort of looking at these immigrant communities with suspicion and scorn, and wanting there to be some sort of institution that can help kind of ease their concerns about what these immigrant groups are doing. A kind of parallel early purpose and function of the Chicago Police Department is as a form of labor control. So for those of you who know the history of Chicago, Chicago in the late 1800s is one of the key scenes, one of the key sites of the rising tide of the labor movement in the United States. So you have people who are out in the streets picketing and protesting for an 8-hour workday, to achieve better pay, to achieve better working conditions, to end child labor, people going on strike, and so on and so forth. And the same types of people who demand the funding of the police department in 1853 in order to surveil the social behaviors of these immigrant groups are also wanting the police department to help them kind of crush this rising tide of labor activity. And that's precisely what the police department does. That you have throughout the course of the late 1800s, you have a series of repeated battles out in the streets of Chicago between working class people and the police department, and with the police department essentially sent there to prevent them from striking, to break up labor actions, and so on and so forth. And the reason why I say all of this and want to sort of highlight its significance is because there's sort of a larger story at work here. And that larger story, whether we're talking about Chicago or whether we're talking about southern cities, whether we're talking about, it doesn't even have to necessarily be municipal police departments. We can just look to some other law enforcement organizations. I mean, the one that immediately comes to my mind is the Texas Rangers, not the baseball team, but the law enforcement organization that, in its early iteration was largely tasked with aiding in the process of settler colonialism and the genocide of indigenous peoples, and also engaging in violence against Mexicans in the Texas-Mexico borderline, And so, like, if we're thinking about all of these things together, we could sort of get a sense of what police departments and sort of parallel law enforcement institutions were sort of designed to do. And I would submit that, just sort of protecting everyone in some sort of equitable way, ensuring public safety in some sort of equitable way, really did not rank particularly highly, if it ranked at all, on the reasons why a lot of these places founded police departments in the first place. That we can look at Chicago and understand that the primary purposes of the police department in its earliest years was as a form of preserving ethnic hierarchy and a form of preserving class hierarchy. And so if we sort of spin that outward and think about today, and think about the fact that, we know from all the data, we know from all the evidence that, the communities that are most subject to heightened police surveillance, heightened police harassment, heightened police violence are primarily communities of color and poor communities. So Black communities especially, but other communities of color and poor communities. And so if we think about that and appreciate that fact and sort of wrap our heads around that, and then think about the fact that the police department in a city like Chicago was designed to preserve ethnic and racial hierarchy, to preserve class hierarchy, perhaps actually the police department is not sort of operating in a way that is significantly out of lockstep with its reasons for existing in the first place, right? So I think that that's an important point for people to sort of wrestle with as we are thinking about the current crisis of policing in the United States. Pardon me. The second sort of key point is very deeply, intimately related to the first. So the second point is that, if we are to know, as I have laid out in that first point, if we are to know that police departments oftentimes were not designed in order to preserve public safety for all citizens in some sort of equitable way, if that was not indeed the reason why they were brought into existence in this country, perhaps it makes sense that they're not especially good at that. And let me draw from the history when I make this point. And actually, this is a for my own, in my own book, I'm taking this language directly from Black activists in the 1960s when I use the language I'm about to use. But I should also point out that Professor Trotter, our esteemed host, also talked about this in his classic book Black Milwaukee. But so the language that Black activists were using in the late 1960s was that Chicago's Black neighborhoods were both quote unquote over policed and underprotected. So this language comes directly from actually organization of Black police officers within the Chicago Police Department known as the Afro-American Patrolmen's League. So it's a group of Black cops who organized themselves in the late 1960s and early 1970s into this affiliation, really as both Black men and police officers, because they have a lot of concerns about the ways in which policing is being conducted in Black neighborhoods in Chicago. And so when they make the argument about over policing and underprotecting, essentially what they are saying at that point in time is that, look, we know from experience, from data, and everything else that Black Chicagoans are vastly disproportionately likely, and this is what they were saying in the 1960s, vastly disproportionately likely to be subject to stop and frisk by Chicago Police Department officers. That Black Chicagoans lived in neighborhoods in which, unlike other neighborhoods in the city, police officers were measured, their efficiency was measured explicitly by arrest quotas. So if you were a police officer working in a Black neighborhood, part of the metric for how you were deemed to be either doing a good job or a bad job was how many people you were arresting, right? The Afro-American Patrolmen's League knew at that point in time that that Black neighborhoods in Chicago were disproportionately likely, tragically so, to be subject to police violence. You know, that over the course of 1968 to 1969 alone, Chicago Police Department officers killed 60 Black people in the city of Chicago. And in most of those cases, they were not able to demonstrate that the people had presented a reasonable threat, or even indeed that they had a weapon. And so the Afro-American Patrolmen's League essentially says, look, our communities are subject to all of this over policing, all of this, disproportionately heavy volume of policing. And then on the other hand, what they said was that Chicago's Black neighborhoods were also underprotected. And what they meant by that, sort of thinking about it as the flip side to the same coin, was they said, for all of that over policing, for all of that police violence, for all of the disproportionate likelihood of arrest and surveillance and harassment and so on and so forth, Black Chicago is also just in a state of sort of perpetual unsafety compared to the rest of the city. In other words, that Black Chicagoans were disproportionately likely to be victimized by intercommunal violence, were disproportionately likely to be the subjects of white supremacist terrorist violence at that point in time. And so, sort of buried in their critique, buried in the quip about Black Chicago being both simultaneously over policed and underprotected, was also kind of a question. And that question that they were implicitly asking, at least, was, so what is the point of all of this over policing? If Black folks in Chicago are subject to all of this over policing and are also not reaping any of the supposed benefits that police are claiming can be derived from that over policing, then what is the point of that over policing in the first place, right? And I think that is important as well, because it speaks quite troublingly, but quite really, to our current state of affairs. I mean, if you were to take a map of Chicago in the year 2019, and if you were to put on that map sort of an outlay of police behavior. So say you were to have a map that shows the neighborhoods where officers were more likely to arrest people, were more likely to stop and frisk people, were more likely to draw their weapons, were more likely to shoot people, and so on and so forth. And then you were to take a second map and had that map reflect where the greatest forms of harm are visited upon people. So where people are disproportionately likely to be shot and subject to gun violence, where people are disproportionately likely to, be carjacked or, so on and so forth. If you were to take those maps and compare them, you would understand that they're basically the same map. Which again, I think it requires asking the question of what the point is, and indeed, when I say what the point is, what I am really trying to say is, why do we think that the police can solve this when we know, when we have all the evidence that shows that they cannot? When the evidence shows that, all of this heightened repressive police presence in and attention to the residents of Black Chicago's communities does not actually result in any sort of increased public safety within those same communities. And sort of by way of a final point on that, I think that people need to really reckon with and ask themselves some questions about about what we think police do well versus what the evidence actually shows. By we, I am taking myself out of that category, but I used to not think that much about, about police not being effective at ensuring public safety. I've learned this from many years of study and many years of reading and conversations with organizers and other scholars. But so let me just, come back to Chicago for a second. So, in the year 2019, I haven't seen data from 2020 yet, but in the year 2019, in cases of first-degree homicide in the city of Chicago, the Chicago Police Department made an arrest in 22 or 23% of cases. So in incidents of first-degree homicide, 22 or 23% of those, the police department made an arrest in them. There was a report that came out recently that said that over the course of the decade of the 20-teens, in cases of sexual assault, the Chicago Police Department made an arrest in between 10 and 20% of cases. And I think it's worth sort of sitting with those numbers, because I would make the case, and perhaps others would disagree with me, but I would make the case that when we think about the forms of harm that people can visit upon one another, I would argue that the two most grievous and terrible forms of harm are homicide and sexual assault. And so if you're going to walk down this path with me and agree that I can at least make that claim that those two forms of harm are some of the worst that can be made, let's ask ourselves what we make then about relying upon a system of public safety, in other words, the police, that has a 75 to 90% failure rate in solving those forms of harm, in bringing someone to justice, and as people would say. I think we have to be very conscious of the fact that Chicago spends $2 billion, billion with a B, every single year on policing, and in these forms of incredible harm, in these in the form of homicide and sexual assault, that are successful by the means that people sort of deem police success. They're successful somewhere between 10 and 22% of the time, which is a pretty miserable return on an investment, if you were to ask me. Which is to say nothing of the violence and harm that police visit upon communities themselves, right? People were wanting to sort of talk about the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin as auguring some sort of sea change in what policing is going to look like going forward. But you don't need to look further than the killing of Ma'Khia Bryant, literally essentially as the trial verdict was being read, to understand that like committing harm against communities is just baked into the DNA and essence of what policing in the United States does, particularly to communities of color. And so I think we need to be really, really honest and clear-eyed about that. Another point that I just want to sort of highlight is just thinking about, because again, I'm trying to use history here to sort of think about how we proceed. History is kind of a way for thinking about not just the present, but perhaps more importantly, thinking about the future. And so, everything, so much of the discourse that's happening right now in our national politics when it comes to policing is conversations about police reform. And I'm very tempted to put reform in quotes there, because there is no real consensus about what police reform seems to look like. That it can look, President Biden has suggested that police reform should entail actually more funding for police to do better training. Some people talk about police reform as, banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants. Some people talk about police reform as, civilian review and so on and so forth. So there's just a real sort of hodgepodge of different visions of what reform looks like. But one of the things that I find troubling is that a kind of troubling commonality across this disparate argument, or these disparate arguments for reform, is sort of people seem to think that this is a reinvention of the wheel, or that this is somehow an especially new idea, and that's just not true. I think actually, you can't really tell the history of policing in the United States without sort of having it be a constant history of police reform. Police have been reformed since there were police, right? I mean, reforms take all sorts of different forms. I mean, reform takes the, technological reform. So, when police are first put into squad cars, that's a reform. When police begin contracting with the federal government to buy, weapons of war from the army to police American cities, that's a reform. Body cameras are a reform, and it's not just technological. I mean, it's policy, it's procedure, it's paperwork, it's all these different things. But the point here is that police reform has been an ongoing and ever-present process, and it's now somehow being pitched as like new and sort of revolutionary, and it's just not. That it's been an ongoing sort of process for many years. And the other point to that is not just to say that it's not new, but also to say that it does not have a particularly good track record historically of actually like reining in police behavior, making police less violent towards the people they police, making police more accountable to the public. It just doesn't have a particularly good history, a good track record historically of doing that. And I think that that's important to understand. I mean, so let me tell you why I think that is. And I'll be very blunt about it. I honestly think that the reason why the history of police reform vis-a-vis making police more accountable, making police less violent, and so on and so forth, the reason why it's not a particularly inspiring historical track record is because, for the most part, police departments do not want to be reformed. Police officers, generally speaking, and I know that there have been some op-eds that people find inspiring and that are, and that maybe do signal some broader cultural shift within police departments that I'm just unaware of and too cynical to see. But I know that there's been these op-eds that have come out since the Chauvin verdict that have basically said this is a wake-up call for all of us who work in law enforcement. We need to do better, and so on and so forth. But really, the longer track record historically here is one in which, for the most part, police officers, police unions especially, have really fought hard against any of these things that will make police more accountable, that will bring greater oversight to police departments, that will really have much in the way of meaningful impact on the ways in which police interact with the people that they are that they are patrolling every day. So I mean, again, we could talk about the history here. I mean, in Chicago, the most important period of police reform in the history of Chicago took place during the 1960s. What happened during the 1960s was that a guy named Orlando Wilson, who was kind of a good government guy, and he was seen as one of the leading criminologists in the United States at the dawn of the 1960s. He was actually the dean of the School of Criminology at the University of California at Berkeley at the beginning of 1960. But basically, Orlando Wilson gets hired by the city of Chicago to leave his post in academia at Berkeley and come be the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. And he's charged basically with coming in, cleaning up a department that many people see as being just sort of hopelessly corrupt and incompetent and so on and so forth. And so he engages in just reform after reform after reform. It would take me an hour to talk about all the various things he reforms, but suffice to say that when it comes to the reforms that are not sort of, that are not technical reforms, that don't involve paperwork and technology and so on and so forth. And when it comes to reforms that don't actually expand police power, because he engages in those reforms as well, that, Orlando Wilson is a huge proponent of the expansion of stop and frisk. He's the one who implements arrest warrants for officers working in Black communities and so on and so forth. But the point here in terms of the accountability piece of this is that one of the things that Orlando Wilson does is he does understand that the police department in Chicago has a problem of trust with huge swaths of the community in the city, particularly around the fact that not only is the police department well known to be just absolutely corrupt, but also people experience its violence and brutality all the time. And so, Wilson says, okay, well, we need to do something about this problem. And so what he proposes is that for the very first time in the history of Chicago, Chicago is going to get an internal investigations division. The police department is going to get an internal investigations division. And so he proposes that very early in his term. And his subordinates, the officers at his command, lose their mind. The head of the Chicago Patrolmen's Association, which is the largest quasi-union representing police officers in the country. I say quasi-union because it operated mostly like a union, but did not have official union status until 1980. But the head of the Chicago Patrolmen's Association literally travels the country to all the places that Orlando Wilson had previously worked to try to gin up dirt on him, to try to get him fired over his suggestion of implementing an internal investigations division. So right at the outset there, the union that represents the majority of Chicago police officers at that time actively rebels against any sort of suggestion of any sort of whisper of accountability for the police. And I think that that's telling. I think that's a really telling historical moment. And I, again, just sort of think about this when we're thinking about what all of this means for right now. Like I was thinking about this history not that long ago, because there was a task force that was impaneled by the city of Chicago last summer in the wake of all of the protests and all of the rebellions in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. There was a task force that was impaneled by the city of Chicago that was essentially asked to study the Chicago Police Department's use of force policy and then issue a set of recommendations about ways to modify the CPD's use of force policy in a way that would make it less violent, in a way that would make it, not a institution that visited such terror upon so many different communities and people within the city. This task force to hear participants included community organizers, community residents, and so on and so forth. They worked their tails off all summer long on drafting a set of proposals. And they issued a set of proposals to the city of Chicago with 155 different recommendations for ways that the Chicago Police Department could change its use of force policies in ways that would, hopefully mitigate and reduce police violence against citizens. The Chicago Police Department rejected 150 of those 155. The 5 that they adopted were essentially the ones that inconvenienced them the least. And so I think we have to be really careful about how much stock and how much energy we are putting into all of these new, proposals for reform, especially ones that ask us to stomach the idea of spending even more money on policing, because this is just not a particularly inspiring history when it comes to reform. These sorts of kind of timid reforms, technocratic reforms, being ways that police violence, that police racism, that the harm that police commit against communities, reform has just not had a good track record of doing that. The very, very final and very, very brief point that I want to make is, so essentially kind of the sort of overarching theme of what I've tried to lay out here is that the crisis that we are in right now is not new, right? I mean, that it has, like, my book begins in 1919, not because policing in Chicago, in particular policing in Black Chicago, looks the same in 1919 as it does in 2021. But it is to say that you can already see glimpses in 1919 of the ways in which policing is not actually going to be an institution that equitably serves all people in the city of Chicago in the same way and in a satisfactory way. But so the crisis is not new, but I also think it's important for people to understand that, resistance to this crisis is also not new. In my book, I write about a variety of different individuals and organizations who, throughout the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, are actively resisting a police institution that they see as insufficient to meeting their needs and wildly abusive. Already in the 1930s and 1940s, editorialists at the Chicago Defender, which is the most important Black-owned newspaper in Chicago, not just in Chicago, but in the country at that point in time, is literally using the language of terrorism to describe the ways that they experience the police department. We're talking about editorialists from 80 years ago, 90 years ago in some cases, who are already talking about this is a system of terrorism, anti-Black terrorism. But you also have people who are fighting against that. You have people who are actively resisting police power. You have, when Chicago's freedom movement, the sort of local iteration of the civil rights movement, when that is underway in the 1950s and especially in the 1960s, you have organizers and activists who are weaving demands to exert better civilian review and civilian control over the police, weaving that into broader sets of civil rights demands because people are so concerned about this problem already at that point in time. And the final sort of historical example of this resistance that I want to leave you with is actually from the early 1970s, 1973 to be precise. There's a citywide coalition that's built in the early 1970s that is an effort to seek community control of the police. And I won't go into the specifics of what community control of the police looked like for them at this point in time. I'm happy to answer questions about it briefly in Q&A if people want. But the reason I bring it up is because a core element of what the citywide coalition was talking about and arguing for and demanding was defunding the police. They didn't have the precise language, defund the police. But the vision that they advanced was precisely what organizers and activists mean now when they say defund the police. So what I mean here is that this citywide coalition that was started by the Black Panther Party, but included dozens and dozens and dozens of community organizations, whether it be Black organizations, whether it be Indigenous organizations, Latinx organizations, white organizations, faith groups, and so on and so forth. When all of these groups were coming together in coalition and community and issuing this demand for community control of the police, at the centerpiece of their argument was a look at the fact that Chicago at that point in time was already spending over $300 million every single year on its police department. And the Citywide Coalition for Community Control of the Police said, look, we don't need to spend that much money on the police. What happens if we take significant chunks of that and invest it into, job training, invest into other social goods that will nourish people, that will help people, reach for, strive for better lives, that will assist people in leading healthier and more enriching lives, right? And so I think that there is some utility in understanding that, these various arguments and slogans, whatever you want to call defund the police, people seem to think that it sort of exists, like that it's in violence with the sort of broader arc of organizing and activism, that it sort of came out of nowhere. And that's just not the case. The slogan itself, the call itself, the language itself of defund the police, yeah, that's new, but the underlying logic is not. The underlying logic is at least 50 years old. And I think that there is some utility in understanding that. And I think that there's perhaps something to be said about the fortifying and edifying effects of knowing that, that the struggles that people are waging have a history, even if we don't necessarily know that history particularly well. And so I will leave it there, and I want to thank you all again, and I'm happy to spend a few minutes here with the time we have left answering any questions that people may have.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon, for those insights from the historical perspective that you've written so well about. We appreciate your commentary and your perspective. We do want to give our audience an opportunity to raise questions. And Evie, if you're alert right now, let's allow people to use the raise hand feature so that they can talk directly and raise their questions directly to Simon. Okay?
Yes, if there are any questions, please either raise your hand or let me know in the chat and I'll unmute you.
Simon, while people are collecting their thoughts, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this notion of occupied territory and the conception of African-American urban communities as an occupied territory, and how you came to see that as a powerful way to frame your analysis of the history of policing, racial policing in Chicago.
That's a great question. I'd be happy to say a few words about that. My confession, as it were, is that this is not my own formulation. I took this, I adopted this precise idiom actually from James Baldwin, who is one of the most important American authors and essayists and social critics in United States history. And so for those who don't know, James Baldwin was a Black gay man from Harlem who had a very fraught relationship with his country. And he wrote a lot about it. He wrote a lot about race in the United States and anti-Blackness in the United States and anti-indigeneity in the United States. He wrote a lot about he wrote a lot about being a gay man and about sort of what that meant in both fictionalized and non-fictionalized ways. But he wrote an essay. So he wrote both fiction and nonfiction, as I said. He wrote an essay in The Nation in the mid-1960s, the title of which was A Report from Occupied Territory. And what this article in The Nation was talking about policing in Harlem. It was talking about how you have this huge wave and raft of police officers, many of them, but not all of them, white, who don't live in the neighborhood and who don't really know the people who do live in the neighborhood, but come into it, you know, heavily armed and willing, and in some cases perhaps eager to commit violence. And that the way that he wrote about them was that this looks very much like an occupying force, an occupying army, right? A sort of foreign invading force coming into a community and treating it, sort of approaching it with hostility and approaching it with violence as sort of the first language and the first approach that they would resort to. Right. And so Baldwin very much was talking about, the relationship between the police in Harlem and the residents of Harlem. You know, Harlem is famously a very, very Black part of New York City. He was talking about the police as really sort of resembling an invading, an occupying force. And I want to add that Baldwin was not alone or unique in doing this in the 1960s, that this language of occupation as applied to the police within Black communities was, it was language that was used by, other, Black radicals like Angela Davis, Black radicals like members of the Black Panther Party. And really what they were saying was, what they were describing was really sort of the contours of this tremendously violent and repressive force that sort of comes into a community from outside with the goal of sort of existing within and containing and repressing people within it, sort of through violence and other coercive measures in a way that was very reminiscent for them of a sort of occupying military force. So when I was, I first read this article by Baldwin many years ago, sort of when I was doing my research on racialized policing, and it really struck me as sort of true with what I was seeing in the in the historical record, and that there were also sort of local versions that echoed the same types of language of what Baldwin was talking about when it came to how Chicagoans were talking about the cops. And so so I say all of that to basically say that I borrowed from one of the great geniuses in American history when I adopted the language of occupied territory and sort of the intellectual framework of occupied territory. And indeed, I would say that I'm very indebted to James Baldwin for sort of helping me think about what exactly that meant, and then sort of thinking about that as a framework that does make a lot of sense when we talk about what policing looks like especially for minoritized communities in the United States.
Okay, all right, thanks very much. Evie, do we have any hands?
I don't see any, and we enabled the audience to unmute themselves. So if you have any question, please feel free.
I know Simon doesn't have much time left. I want to make sure that our audience has the last couple of questions, if there are any. I will take advantage of this opening. Simon, another one for you. There are a lot of graduate students in this audience, and in relationship to what comes next in the historiography of policing, what do you see this next generation of policing research having to do with racialized violent policing? What are we going to learn? What do we need to learn from this next wave of scholarship by this younger generation coming up?
Sorry, even after a year, I still sometimes forget to mute myself. That's a great question. and it's one that I've been thinking a lot about, and I see a name or two actually on the attendees list of graduate students who I know who are doing really important work on this. So I'll sort of offer a few thoughts on that. I mean, so one of the things that's always fascinated me, partly because you know, living in Chicago for years and doing a lot of research at the University of Chicago, I've always been struck by the sort of pervasive presence of University of Chicago police, not just on campus, but actually in adjacent neighborhoods over which the police has jurisdiction. The university police has jurisdiction. So people who live in surrounding neighborhoods around the university sort of exist under the overlapping jurisdictions of not just the Chicago Police Department, but the University of Chicago Police Department. And that's really weird and really troubling and really anti-democratic, because, you know, the University of Chicago has essentially walled it off as some, you know, sort of an edifice against the larger community in which it sits. You know, that University of Chicago and Hyde Park, in which it's part, is a pretty affluent neighborhood, and I mean a diverse neighborhood, but, you know, a neighborhood that is not diverse in the sense of like being, you know, majority Black or anything like that. It's just it's literally diverse. And the neighborhoods that surround the University of Chicago are majority Black, and are in many cases, not all, majority poor. And these are the neighborhoods that the University of Chicago Police Department has jurisdiction over in a way that, you know, when we are talking about community members who don't have a relationship with the University of Chicago Police Department, but are subject to its jurisdiction, that's very strange and troubling. And so one of the things that I've really long been interested in and wanted to see people do is find out more about campus policing, and both its history and also its sort of relationships to the larger municipal police departments with which they coordinate, and kind of the, you know, the ramifications of that. There's a graduate student on this call right now, Yalili, who is writing a dissertation on that, and that's wonderful. And I'm so excited by her work. But I think that there's probably, you know, just because one person is working on something doesn't mean that other people shouldn't. And I would add that actually sort of spins outward to just thinking about all of the various ways in which policing has sort of filtered out beyond the confines of formal metropolitan police departments, and sort of made its way into these other areas. So thinking about, you know, like transit authority police officers, right? And thinking about all these various, like, you know, all these, you know, housing authority police and stuff like that, right? Thinking about how all of these various police institutions that are not, you know, if we're taking the city of Chicago as the example, all of these police institutions that are not the Chicago Police Department, but are police departments within the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
I think we have to figure more about the history of these things in order to sort of make sense of the whole scope and scale of just how widespread policing is beyond just the confines of the municipal police department level. Part of the reason why I bring that up is because I was really struck when I was sort of finishing my book, when I was crunching numbers from data about, you know, the police department in the 1970s versus the police department now. The Chicago Police Department employs fewer sworn officers today than it did 50 years ago. So the Chicago Police Department, in terms of its actual size when it comes to sworn personnel, is smaller than 50 years ago. But we know from all the evidence, from all the data at a national level, that there's way more police officers in the United States today than there was 50 years ago. And so what that means is that these police officers are being employed by these non-municipal police departments. So I think we need to think through that. I'll just say, I think just sort of one more point. You know, my book is, my research is very, 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 very embedded in in thinking about the policing of Blackness, the policing of Black people. And I think most importantly, what I was trying to do with the book was trying to offer a sense historically of being policed as a Black Chicagoan, and sort of what that looked like and how that unfolded and took shape over time. And the reason that I say that is because I think a lot of our scholarship, quite rightly and quite necessarily, thinks about policing through not necessarily a Black-white binary, but sort of channels it through the anti-Blackness of policing, especially. And that's what my book does. And I did that for a particular reason, because I think that is an absolutely critical story to tell. I think it's the most important story to tell when it comes to thinking about policing. But we know, modern statistics show us that the people who are most disproportionately likely to face police violence are actually Indigenous folks, right? And so, I think we don't know a whole lot about, sort of historically speaking, about the sort of policing of Native communities. And I think that that's a really important direction to go. And I think that it's going to be complicated, right? Because there's a lot of different layers to that, whether it comes, between sort of urban Native folks who are subject to racist policing in a city like Chicago, whether it's people who live on reservations and are subject to other forms of law enforcement there, and so on and so forth. And so I'd like to see some more scholarship that's done on sort of the relationship between policing and police and other minoritized and marginalized communities, because I think that it's not to say that we know all that we are ever going to know about policing and anti-Blackness, because I think we're just scratching the surface of that. I want people to keep working on that. But I think also, if I were to go back and try to wrap my head around a different direction that I might have taken my book, it might have involved a more sort of multicultural approach to thinking about how policing operates as sort of a system of racial control, at a really sort of fundamental level.
Okay. Those are very, very, I think, compelling perspectives on the next wave of scholarship. I do want to say that I appreciate very much your capacity to, to go quite deep into the experiences of this particular group, African American. And in some ways, I suspect that it will provide something of a model as people try to broaden the scope to involve Indigenous people, Latinx people, and across the board, Asian Americans and so on. And so I think the next generation will be in your debt for the contribution you made. And we really appreciate your presence here. And thanks very much for sharing your research and your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much, Professor
So give,
Trotter.
give Simon a round of virtual applause. Thank you. Okay, before we go, I want to applaud. Before we go, I want to remind people that next Friday, we're going to have a public forum in which we'll have a couple of guests with us to really talk about taking stock based upon Simon's talk, as well as the talk of Michael Fortner last week. And so we want to invite you to come and join us. It's going to be an audience-driven kind of a conversation, but we will have two scholars who are currently involved in writing and researching on this subject. Dan Nagin from Carnegie Mellon University and Luther Adams from the University of Washington in Tacoma. So please join us. Thanks very much and have a good weekend. Okay. Bye.